Hello, everybody, to this webinar about 8 critical success factors around your desktop virtualization projects with IGEL. I'm very happy that you all joined to that meeting. My name is Matthias Haas. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at IGEL. I'm responsible for the global product strategy and product portfolio, no matter whether it's software and hardware devices that we are selling. I would like to introduce you to Scott Behrens, who is one of our very valued customers, and I think he's going to add some more color to the things that we are going to talk about today. So Scott, please introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Scott Behrens. I'm the IT operations manager for Strayer University. We're an online and on-ground university spread over the eastern third of the United States. We've got about 75 locations. We cater primarily to adult education, adults who are going back to college to get their degrees.
And with us also Doug Lane. Doug, please introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Doug Lane. I have been around the end user computing space for quite a while on both of the vendor side. Spent about 4.5 years at AppSense, as well as with a startup company called Virtual Computer that was later acquired by Citrix. But more recently, I've been acting as an independent consultant in the industry, and I'm happy to be here to contribute to the discussion.
Perfect. Thank you, Doug. So I think the reason why we have Doug and Scott on this call today is that we want to give you some backgrounds on how we see the challenges in typical VDI projects. And actually, Doug and myself, we were sitting together on a project trying to identify the common grounds that we see where IGEL is able to support those projects and just do the twist to move that project in the right direction. So what we did in that case was we started to discuss about how can we gather all this data and information. And I think, Doug, you did a great job talking to a lot of IGEL team members, partners, and customers. And through that whole process, we were able to really figure out that there is a common ground out there where the needle is driven in the project into the right direction, or where there are challenges. What is the common problems in those projects? And with that, we were able to identify recurring topics, themes from successful projects, how IGEL fits into that success story, and how we can make the difference to drive those projects in the right direction. And for this reason, as I said, to add some more color to that, we have also invited Scott, and we would like to, during that discussion, or the 8 different factors that we have identified, that Scott gives us some more flesh to those topics. And for that, I'm very happy that we have you here on board. And if you would like to introduce your company and the Strayer University and how this project moved forward with IGEL.
Sure. So like I touched on before, I work for Strayer University, and our experience with IGEL has really grown over the last couple of years. We started out with a small pilot converting some existing old computers using the IGEL operating system on our existing hardware, and things went well. We gradually expanded, and we're just now completed conversion of all of our staff, faculty, and professor end user computing units to IGEL managed devices. So we are nearly 100% on IGEL thin clients, and we're using that to attach to a Citrix Zen Desktop virtual desktop environment. So that's where we are, and we're really looking to attack a couple things with this project. Number one was that our existing computers were getting pretty old, and the budget to replace them had been kicked down the road for a couple of refresh cycles. We were really, my team was doing a great job of keeping those machines up and running well past their normal lifespan, and the CFO was very happy with those results, but our end user experience was starting to degrade, as you can imagine, over time. And so we really need to make a move. We decided to move to a virtual desktop infrastructure deployment, and really what convinced us was what we were able to do with the IGEL endpoints. There's a lot more when you're looking at converting to virtual desktops than just the technology that's involved. I'm really focused on the user experience and making sure that it's intuitive and simple to use and better than the experience they were having with their old hardware. So that's where things have kind of started and where they've moved to now.
All right, thank you. So I think that really is the background on your project in Strayer University. And I think why we walk through those different fields of things that we think that make a difference. I'm very happy that you can also add some more background information on that.
So what I thought I'd do, so as Matthias and I were kind of working through this analysis, what we found, kind of went into it thinking perhaps there would be some big ticket items that were kind of the aha of this, this is why desktop projects succeed or fail. I think what we found instead was that there are lots of little reasons that make the difference. And, it's more in the details where either you get these details right, or if you don't, it becomes kind of the age-old kind of death by a thousand cuts where, no one problem is insurmountable, but collectively they put a tax on your team and on your project. So it could be anything from, getting the OS and the hardware working together, the time it takes to push out updates or provision devices, pesky issues with drivers and peripherals not working correctly. Or, as Scott mentioned, sometimes there's, issues around hardware where you think you need to make a big hardware purchase to make the project work. The finance team won't sign off on it, and you're kind of stuck in a situation where you can't make the environment work as well as it should. So as we were going through this, we kind of, had a little bit of the eye-opening moment of the fact that it's all these little details that collectively add up. And what we tried to do was identify, okay, what are the common buckets that these things fall into, so we can use them to better advise customers on how to get out in front of them and proactively address these as part of their desktop deployment, or as a way to improve the way that their existing deployment is operating. So I'll let Matthias kind of step through some of the key themes here and share some perspective on that.
Yeah, and hey, Doug, sorry, Matthias, for cutting in. Can you jump back one real quick, Doug?
Sure.
I just wanted to touch on, all these small details that make a big impact are totally true. And they're definitely things that when we did our big conversion and we started our big project, we had to take into consideration, and we had to account for all of these things ahead of time. Like, quite frankly, the end user isn't going to see any of these things. They're going to notice them when these things aren't working or when there's a problem here. And so getting out in front of this stuff, managing the stuff, having these things under control and leading to a great end user experience is going to be the payoff on your project, and whether or not your project is a success and can continue to move forward and grow, or whether it's going to be rolled back or dropped or something like that. And so this is the sort of thing that, the stakeholders, the business leaders, the technical leaders really need to make sure they're on top of, because the end users aren't going to understand the excuses why they're having a slow login, or why their USB key doesn't work, or anything like that. And when you talk about end user computing devices, they're just not going to want to care about excuses or reasons. They're going to want their things to work. They're going to want to do their business. The accountant is going to want to do his accounting, and the receptionist is going to do her receptioning. And these these are the things that the people owning the project need to be on top of.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. So I think this is absolutely, all those small little things make a difference. And if you add all of those small little things together, I think it's good to see that they have some common ground. And the critical parts really, if you have a look on those topics that we have identified, or the buckets, is around two things: manageability and simplicity of deployment and end user experience. So with these 8 success factors that we have here, I think we do have a long history in IGEL. Deployment speed and simplicity. I think when we started more than 10 years ago with our central management tool, that was the key reason that we introduced the UMS, and we constantly were working on moving this product to the top-notch tool being used in this field. End user experience, no doubt about that this is key, especially in the VDI environment. If people don't recognize that they are working in a virtualized environment, that's the best feedback that you can get, because then it is exactly what it should be, a model that people really don't have to care where the data sits or where the application sits. Endpoint hardware compatibility, we invested a lot of time and resources to make IGEL as the operating system that runs on any x86 hardware endpoint infrastructure. Management simplicity and the reliability is key to drive the operation of your project forward, and not only to drive the deployment in the right direction, but also to keep the user experience and the security of the deployment in good shape. Endpoint hardware longevity, yes, we are focusing on software, but we are also selling our own hardware, and this hardware is custom-made around the requirements of a typical VDI deployment, which very often ends up in long hardware longevity support that IGEL is moving forward. Talking about our technology partners, this is really something that is very important to me personally and the team, as we are managing more than 75 technology partners on the IGEL platform. And the platform is the one thing, but it's important to have is the foundation to enable those different components, starting from smart card readers to digital dictation to single sign-on solutions. All of those components need to be deployable, manageable, and need to be reliable working together. And this is what we are ensuring together with our technology partners on the IGEL platform. Anywhere access, key driver since a couple of years to enable people to access their devices that they have under management anywhere at any time. No matter whether they are sitting on campus, no matter whether we have home office users or people that have mobile devices all over the world. Two things are important: being able to support them and manage them, but also onboarding those environments, especially together with UD Pocket. And last but not least, security is a key play in all of these deployments. How do you ensure that your endpoint devices keep up with the level of security that you have in your data center? All of these 8 factors we have seen also do matter to our customers and have also a positive resonation on the feedback that we have collected. And I'd want you to leave with that and hand over to Doug, who can add some more colors together with Scott to give you an idea of what I was talking about now theoretically.
Great. Yeah, what I thought I would do is I'll kind of double click down on some of these, maybe take a few at a time and talk about some of the next level detail that came through as we were out talking with the different customers and stakeholders. And then obviously, weave that in with some real world relevance from Scott as we go. But I think from a management standpoint, what we heard quite a bit was that, the ability to define policies and configurations for these devices in a simple way. It's not sufficient just to be able to build images and push them out. You need, to be able to have different categories of configurations for different locations, different geographies, different users, and have that not get unwieldy as it starts to grow in complexity. So certainly from an IGEL perspective, being able to have more of a drag and drop approach that maybe looks familiar to people in a way that other management consoles they've used in the past, like Active Directory, play out is important. But also the communication, it's not just about designing the policies, it's about delivering them. And that includes, making sure you have reliable communication between the console and the devices, so you're not pushing out updates and having only a small percentage or hit the endpoints that they're targeted for. As well as, as we get to more geographic deployments, being able to push those updates out in an efficient manner, keeping the size of the updates as small as possible, and then using intelligence in terms of, sending it once to a location and then allowing that that one data transmission to then propagate to all the devices in that location. IGEL refers to that as buddy updates, but it kind of tells the story in an interesting way there. Along with that, from a third-party integration standpoint, obviously people go into it thinking about the big ticket integrations, things like Citrix receiver and the VMware client and so forth. That's important, certainly, and I think making sure that the vendor you're working with can support multiple versions of those clients. You don't want to be in a situation where maybe you have an older version of Citrix running in your environment that's not compatible with the client in the thin client that you're trying to use. That could be a big stumbling block. But also you run into some situations where vendors are kind of using their own variation on these clients and therefore may not have all of the latest and greatest features. But I think more than that, Matthias mentioned earlier that IGEL's got about 75 third-party integrations. So there's obviously much more in this picture besides VMware and Citrix. You have, kind of the next level down of the Imprivadas in the healthcare space or other vertical specific applications. You've got, performance optimization applications like a Lakeside Software, for example. But also we've even found in some of the customer deployments we looked at that, people are reliant on niche products. There are customers in the Nordic region in Europe where, there are certain third-party applications for, say, authentication that are popular in that market. It's not going to necessarily be a brand name here in the US, but it's important for that geography. So it's a great example of where I think having an open dialogue with your vendor around what you're using and making sure that there's enough breadth there in terms of third-party integrations is very important. And then finally, Matthias touched on the idea of longevity. That can come from buying devices that last longer, and I think that's something IGEL prides itself on. But more than that, it's also extending the life of your existing devices, and that's where from an IGEL perspective, things like the Universal Desktop Converter or the UD Pocket USB boot option. These are all tools that might be useful in terms of deferring a potential hardware purchase. So for example, in that scenario earlier where the finance folks are holding up a hardware refresh, you may have more tools at your disposal to be able to get life out of those PCs you may already have in your environment, or other thin clients that maybe the vendor themselves doesn't support anymore, but may still have some life in it if you were to convert it to something like IGEL OS or even boot it from a USB. So,
Doug, that's a good point. And in fact, on our project, that was the way I get started. Was I was able to get finance to commit to a small investment to use our existing hardware and just purchase the IGEL operating systems for this handful of machines to get a good test going. So it was super easy for us to get up and running and do kind of a proof of concept without having to even physically move any hardware. We just used our existing hardware that were sitting on desks and rolled right into testing IGEL very, very easily. And then, on top of that, you mentioned the hardware longevity. This was a big selling point for us because we, like I said earlier, we really extended our refresh cycle. We extended it way beyond ROI. We were probably spent enough time and money. It's hard to monetize time for salaried employees, but we definitely went way beyond the ROI on our hardware life. And I think the typical refresh cycle for a piece of endpoint hardware to maximize ROI is somewhere around 4 years nowadays, and we were way beyond that. But because of the way the IGELs are made, and because we're primarily using the UD3 model, there's no moving parts in there. There are no fans. There are no spinning hard disks. There's literally kind of nothing to break down physically inside of those machines. And we're anticipating, I'm projecting to get 7 to 10 years, hopefully, out of these devices. And I wouldn't be surprised if they lasted longer. They're super solid. And in our rollout, as we rolled out our most recent phase where we rolled out 1,400 devices, we had one device that we had an issue with in the field, and when we had it shipped back in, there wasn't even an issue with it. So we were like 1,400 for 1,400. Just everything was just really solid, and really kind of nothing to go wrong from a hardware standpoint inside of them.
And what was your experience, Scott, in terms of the actual, things like getting the devices to connect and pushing out the configurations and things like that? How did that go with your deployment?
Yeah, so that was all fantastic, and it went better than I expected. So when you first boot up a physical IGEL device, I guess there's code in it that it will go and search for the IGEL management server. And when it does, if it finds one, it'll download the configurations and the settings and self-configure itself. So I was able to send teams to, our 75 locations. They plugged the devices in, and it was, no harder than really plugging in a monitor in some cases. And the devices would self-configure themselves. The people who I had in the field, they didn't need any logins. They didn't need to re-image the machines. It was all done automatically when the device is plugged in. Each device took maybe 5 minutes to get the latest configuration settings, and the people at the endpoint were literally just, plugging in computers. It was super easy. It couldn't have gone any faster. And in the past, when we open up new campuses and I have to send teams to set up traditional endpoints, it's a major project getting 6 to 10 machines online. It could take these guys in the field, half the day to get things up and running. They'd be downloading images and configurations across the WAN, a 20 gig Windows image, and a lot of administrator involvement. And these IGEL devices, they just reach out, they look for the advertisement of the management server, and they pretty much self-configure themselves. And I would just have an admin drop them into a group that would give them some local settings, like for printers, and we'd be up and running in really in no time. So we were able to move very quickly.
Yeah, and I think your point about the hardware, it was interesting as well, because obviously you ended up buying IGEL hardware in the end, but it wasn't a prerequisite to get started. And I think that's the important piece, where I think a lot of vendors they're in there to try to sell you thin clients first and foremost, and the management is kind of an afterthought. So I think turning that on its head, thinking about software and management first, and then extending the life of the existing hardware, and obviously the day will come where you do need to buy new hardware, and you want to make the best choice there. But I think it shouldn't be something that the vendor is able to drive as the start of the discussion, because it obviously isn't necessarily have to be the first step in the process.
Yeah, and that was something that really got us rolling early in the beginning. So I was able to do this POC with a handful of machines with just a couple of USB sticks to convert our existing machines. And then I worked with a pre-sales engineer on the phone for maybe a half hour to configure the devices exactly the way that it would work best for my organization. Like I said before, we use Citrix Zen Desktop. Other customers probably use VMware Horizon or whatever VMware is calling their desktop virtualization product now. And but we were able to go in under 30 minutes and strip out all the unneeded services, customize everything, whether the wallpaper background or the login screens, and remove things like start menus and local application, and really kind of customize that operating system. Because in the end, the IGEL OS is it kind of turns the device into an appliance. Like, I don't think about my endpoints as being computers the way that we use them to connect to Zen Desktop. I think about them being an appliance, more like more like your phone or any other Linux type of device that just works, and the configurations are in there, and it's just kind of simple to use. We were able to strip it down so it had a single purpose. It had exactly what it needed to do its job, and it didn't have a bunch of extraneous services or options or anything like that. And the amazing thing, making sure I'm speaking about simplicity, was that it was literally under a 30-minute phone call to have our management environment up and running and our endpoints all configured with a custom image. It takes my team days to build new Windows images when we do that, and we literally did it in under 30 minutes.
Yeah, and I think on a similar note, I mean, I'll kind of touch briefly also on one of the other deployments I encountered, which was with the healthcare network, and in this case, they already had a VDI deployment in place using another vendor for the management, and they were finding it was taking, through the kind of cohesiveness of the OS and the management console, it was taking them upwards of, half an hour or so to go in and re-image devices and things like that. And they were kind of struggling as well with some of the repurposing of hardware. So again, going in there with a cohesive package that includes desktop conversion and then an OS and management console that have been really kind of thought through from the ground up to make this stuff simple and reliable, made a big difference and ultimately got them down to under 10 minutes for the same tasks that were taking them 30 minutes in the past. So kind of a good before and after example there as well, where they weren't in that case a greenfield environment. So I will shift gears slightly. I can get control of my mouse here to user experience. So I think there's obviously different ways to approach the endpoint OS when you're running a VDI environment or a Zen app type environment. You can use Windows-based, which devices which have a much kind of heavyweight footprint, require antivirus, things like that are kind of falling under favor for the reasons you just touched on, Scott, where you don't necessarily want to have all that overhead. It's the whole point of using a virtual desktop deployment is to kind of minimize the footprint on the endpoint. So IGEL's perspective in the bet it's placed is that Linux is the way to go when it comes to this hardware footprint. I think often what you can find with Linux is that it's going to be more responsive, particularly on older hardware, as well as kind of cutting out a lot of that overhead. At the same time, Linux is not something that many people think about as an OS you can put in front of non-technical users. So it's critical to choose an OS from a Linux perspective that kind of puts a friendly front end on that, and has also addressed all of the various peripherals and driver type issues that could get in the way of a good user experience. So again, it's I think an area that as Matthias mentioned, IGEL puts a lot of effort into, and I think that shows to where even if an existing Linux-based OS is installed on a thin client, we've come across a lot of examples where converting that hardware to IGEL OS can actually yield a better experience for the user just through that one step. Along with that, there's a kind of a sustained focus on making sure that those drivers are up to date. But also, one interesting thing that IGEL has done that kind of came up in a lot of these customer conversations is this option of doing a custom partition where you can, if there is a particular very specialized driver, for example, or plugin or something that you need in your endpoint that's not in the stock IGEL OS, it's actually quite easy to create one of these custom partitions and add that dynamically to the endpoint OS to solve obstacles that you might encounter as part of the deployment. So again, those kind of death by 1,000 cuts issues, if you run into something that's very niche, you're still going to be able to potentially accommodate that and remove that obstacle from your the progress of your project.
Yeah, speaking of that end user experience, we did a couple of these things. I had Wise come in here before we went all in on IGEL, before we made all our decisions. I've vetted a bunch of competitors, and I used the UD Pocket, which is the IGEL operating system on a USB key, and I booted a Wise thin client with the IGEL OS, and the performance in Zen Desktop connecting to our infrastructure was better running the IGEL OS than it was on the Wise. And those Wise sales team, they were a little bit surprised, and kind of said that they'd get back to me and they would talk to their team about it a little more, that there were probably some optimizations that we had enabled that maybe weren't enabled on the Wise unit through our OS. But what I found was that the idea of a virtual desktop infrastructure and making that conversion from having Windows endpoints in the organization and virtualizing them, that's really kind of only half of the solution, right? Is virtual, whether it's Citrix or VMware or any other virtual desktop provider, the virtual desktops in the data center are really only half of it. The other half is the endpoints, and Citrix and VMware aren't providing those, and they're not even providing a ton of guidance. I mean, they provide certified endpoints or recommendations. I'm sure that vendors can get certified with them, but they're really not pushing anything or recommending anything. And my first exposure to IGEL was at the Citrix Executive Briefing Center down in Fort Lauderdale, and they had at the time they had a lab down there, and most of the machines they were demoing on for the executives coming in were IGEL devices. And that was where we first got introduced to IGEL at a time when I think IGEL was relatively new to the US market quite a few years ago. And that kind of opened us up to this idea that having a Windows endpoint to connect to a virtual Windows desktop in my data center wasn't simplifying things. Essentially, it was doubling the number of Windows endpoints I had, and doubling the amount of management work I had to do, and doubling the amount of images I had to manage. And this idea of having kind of Windows on top of Windows wasn't the direction that we felt was the future. It wasn't the direction that fit the philosophy of a virtual desktop infrastructure. And so making the decision to go to virtual desktops for all the benefits that they offer, whether it's reliability or mobility or customization or any of the cost savings, management efficiencies, all those great reasons to go to virtualization. When you're putting them on top of Windows endpoints, whether it's a Windows CE environment or a thin client, and I guess IGEL has Windows endpoints as well, Matthias. So I don't mean to badmouth an IGEL product on your webinar.
That's okay.
But just kind of wrapping my head around the idea of doubling the number of Windows endpoints, having a virtual one and a physical one, just didn't make sense to us. That really kind of making sure our Windows endpoints were secure in our data center was the direction that we wanted to go, and having secure, reliable, easy to manage devices out in the field was kind of the right way to do things. So
great. Yeah, and I'll share a couple other examples from some of the organizations that we kind of identified during the project as well. So that, it's an interesting one, and I think these real world examples are helpful because, again, these particular situations on their own are not, things that show up everywhere, but I think they're kind of illustrative of these kind of small details that pop up that often can kind of, throw months of lag onto your project. So there was a an architecture design firm that IGEL engaged with, where they were, you know, as obviously doing high-end design work is kind of a you know, fairly ambitious use case when you're using virtual desktops, and they were running some issues with, you know, 4K resolution, which is important for the work they were doing. They had thin clients in place from hard vendors like Dell and HP that had the requisite ports, but once they were trying to actually plug the monitors in, they weren't getting their full resolution. So this was another example where just going in there and converting their existing hardware, they were able to get part of the way there. So some of these HP devices, they were able to just convert to IGEL OS. And just by doing that, they were able to get the full 4K resolution on both monitors. The Dell ones, unfortunately, still didn't work after the conversion, but it was, you know, basically immediately with existing hardware they owned, knocked down that obstacle. And then, you know, ultimately, again, you know, IGEL didn't go in there trying to force them to throw away all their existing hardware. The first order of business was to try to make it work with what they had. And then they kind of, from there, based on that experience, ultimately ended up deciding to add in IGEL hardware as they continue to kind of build out the environment. So again, great example where if you have this ambitious plan to roll out VDI, but your designers can't get full resolution on their workstations, you could see where that would basically result in a lot of uncomfortable IT executive meetings in that company, which again, you know, seems like a small detail, but it can be the type of thing that completely derails a project. You know, another interesting one, this was about a 3,000 seat Dell deployment. You know, they were kind of happily using or semi-happily using it for a while, but they were just getting these kind of nagging complaints from clinicians that were very kind of non-specific. It's like, you know, the desktop's laggy, it's not responding. I'm running into just issues with my experience using the device. And again, what we found in that case was that once these guys did a 100-seat pilot with IGEL, similar to how Scott started, and ultimately what was discovered is that if we converted these devices to IGEL, you know, there were some networking issues that were the kind of the root source of the problem. So just by adding in some inexpensive Wi-Fi adapters that worked well with IGEL OS, they were able to take that existing hardware and basically have a night and day experience where the clinicians started kind of thanking them for quote unquote fixing Wi-Fi in the environment. And they started to hear that so much that they actually started putting IGEL stickers on all of the WISE devices in the environment to kind of, you know, signal to the clinicians that that device was a good one to go do their work on.
Yeah, and you know, you mentioned something there that's interesting that I think is a benefit of IGEL compared to some of its competitors, and that's where you said that they added inexpensive Wi-Fi adapters. I think that when you talk about that IGEL OS, because it's an optimized, customized version of Linux at its root, that, you know, that customer, that hospital was able to find Wi-Fi adapters that were Linux compatible, and they were able to easily work with the IGEL OS. I know that for us, we had some USB scanners that we had to make sure worked, and we were able to find Linux drivers for them, and it worked straight away with the IGEL OS. And so the idea that the core of the IGEL OS is Linux means that there's going to be lots of ways to find compatibility for some of these custom devices that you may find in your environment. I don't know how that plays out if you talk about the operating systems of some of the competitors, if they're as easy to find compatible drivers or devices for.
This pretty much, I think, depends on how good the original manufacturer provides drivers. But in general, I think what we are doing a lot is we are test driving those drivers and adjusting them to be integrated onto our platform. So I think that's the magic why very often things work like a charm, as we have a lot of experience how to manipulate drivers and how to make them, stabilize them, and enable those drivers that you find very often also in the open source community to fit into our system.
Yeah, and I think just some of it's just a mindset too, and a priority. Because IGEL puts the software at the center of the value it provides, rather than kind of thinking of itself as a hardware company where the software is an afterthought in the way that some other vendors do. I think it's that mindset where I think IGEL proactively tackles this, and I think it kind of is an interesting segue to the next topic around deployment speed. And I think we talked about this a little bit earlier. We were talking about management, but some of it has to do with the, kind of the time it takes to create the policies and the reliability of establishing those device connections and pushing out, the configurations and updates and things like that. But I actually think the OS compatibility plays into this quite a bit as well, where if you're a thin client vendor that's pushing its own hardware, you're not going to invest as much effort in being able to support the hardware from other vendors. And I think that multi-vendor support, it's come up a couple of times around going in and getting started quickly with what you have. In order for that to work, you need to have this multi-vendor OS support, and it needs to be kind of a commitment from the thin client vendor to not only provide a great experience on their own hardware. I think also, some of the deployment options we talked about, the ability to quickly and with a high success rate convert devices is a big one as well. But also, I think Scott mentioned the UD Pocket being useful to him, where again, if you can just quickly plug a USB stick into an existing piece of hardware, boot it from that USB device, and quickly get that device provisioned to your management environment, it's going to, that may not be how you deploy all your devices, but if you can get up and running quickly, it's not putting these big daunting projects or issues at the front end of your project. You get moving quickly with what you have, and then over time you can figure out how to further optimize the way that you source and deploy the actual hardware.
Yeah, and it can also serve as a great kind of fallback for maybe mistakes that were made. Maybe a team got a little bit out in front of the hardware purchasing and wanted to kind of do things business as usual with endpoints, and realize that a conversion to a virtual infrastructure is kind of a great way to go in the future. It allows you to fall back your deployment and still get value out of your investment. You don't have to buy the new endpoints. Just convert what you've already had. You don't have to wait 3-4 years to get it done. You can easily optimize the hardware that you've already got and take advantage of it just by updating that OS and putting something that ends up being much easier to manage and much more secure.
Yeah, there was actually, I think from a management standpoint, another interesting story that we came across was with an insurer here in the U.S., large insurance company, and they were using certificates extensively in their environment. Like you, Scott, they had a lot of different locations, and what was happening is that every time they were provisioning new devices to a location, the IT person had to actually pre-stage the certificates on the device and literally fly out to these different locations to deploy the devices, which was obviously not good for his quality of life or efficiency. And another case where, again, using kind of alternative deployment models like UD Pocket, he kind of shifted over to pre-staging those certificates, using the UMS to kind of set everything up, but then target them onto UD Pocket devices that he could then just ship out to these remote locations. And because you have that kind of low touch experience that Scott mentioned earlier, these non-technical users could basically plug those UD Pocket devices into an existing piece of hardware. It boots up, it's got the certificate it needs, the UMS on the back end pushes down the right, kind of profiles and configurations, and they're off to the races without this poor guy having to get on a plane. So I think it's, again, these things are, it's not the type of thing that maybe somebody would think to ask about at the beginning of a project, but suddenly you find yourself, hopping on planes every week or two because this is something that the vendor you chose could not accommodate.
Yeah, and it goes further than that too. Like I've got campuses in Texas and Arkansas and New Jersey and all across the country, and really the way things are evolving, I don't have full-time hands on the ground IT support at every one of our campuses. We've got phone support, but we're now able to really reduce the need to send contractors or send hands to those individual campuses. We can deploy when there are new employees come in or there's an increase in headcount in one of our locations. We're able to deploy machines just by dropping one in a box, mailing it across the country, and a receptionist or a director or a faculty member can plug it in themselves and get it up and running in under 10 minutes. There's really no need for any technical expertise at the endpoint.
Great. And I think, this kind of dovetails on that a bit. So this, obviously you have remote office locations, but increasingly a lot of organizations also have home users growing. It's becoming a big trend, including in some large companies. And this is where I think it gets even harder if you get a home location where you definitely don't have any on-site IT staff, and you don't even have a lot of visibility into the actual infrastructure in place. So this is where I think having a method of reliably and securely connecting those home office users into the virtualized environment is critical. IGEL, in its case, has something called the IGEL Cloud Gateway that kind of serves this function. And again, it's all about just making it so it just works. Anyone can kind of stand up a VPN gateway or some type of a method of landing secure connections into the environment, but it's got to be simple and it's got to just work, because otherwise you're going to be on the phone doing some very difficult remote troubleshooting sessions. So that's kind of, I think, an important part of the equation, and it's growing in importance as more home users are in place.
And that's something that I've evolved on as well. So even when we talk about our corporate kind of mindset on this, in the past, I thought about each of our campuses kind of as branch offices that needed these dedicated connections, these site-to-site VPNs, and that everybody needed to be on our network. And what IGEL and VDI have allowed us to do is kind of think about these campus users as remote users instead of as branch offices. And with that sort of philosophy, thinking about them as remote users, it's allowed us to be more agile. It's allowing us to open up more locations quicker. There's less of a reliance on the infrastructure at the location. There's less of an investment in opening up new locations. And so I don't think it's a secret, but we're looking at expanding our footprint over the next 12 months, growing our organization, being able to serve more students in the future, and the virtual infrastructure and this mindset that we can move quickly and we can have a very limited infrastructure on the ground is kind of allowing us to do that. Think kind of getting rid of this idea of branch offices and kind of turning it into remote users has allowed us to do that. And I think that's the direction the entire industry is going. This idea of investing in branch offices where you have a small number of staff to justify the large investment, it kind of restricts corporate growth. And so any way to minimize that initial investment is something that can help your organization grow.
Yeah, and I think it's also an interesting area where, we've talked a lot about something like UD Pocket and the role it can play with kind of corporate devices, but I think it can actually play quite an interesting role here as well, where if you've got home users that are perhaps using a BYOD device that IT doesn't know much about, the security of that device, or have any management control over Windows, or want to have any, visibility into it. It's an interesting solution to be able to take a personally owned device, boot it from a UD Pocket. You've got a secure footprint to launch desktops on that device, even if you don't want to get into the business of the user's personal machine. Pair that with something like the IGEL Cloud Gateway, and you've got a really low cost and highly secure, highly manageable approach. And I ran into really an interesting example of this with a large insurance company in Germany, where they've got about 11,000 Citrix users, of which about 750 work at home. And these users were really struggling. They had kind of a very complex VPN models. So they would have dedicated VPN tunnels with dedicated hardware at each of these home locations. and it was kind of cumbersome for the user, expensive to maintain, and it was also making management difficult. Even though they could have kind of persistent connectivity over the VPN tunnels, things would get bottlenecked with the VPN gateway, where whenever they would have to push out updates to these devices, it would literally take them over a month just to get these 750 users up to date with the latest firmware, just because of bandwidth constraints at the gateway. And then what was also happening is they were running into issues with quality. The home users were relying on things like Skype for Business for phone calls and things like that. And as the internet service providers changed up their infrastructure, started adopting things like IP version 6 and so forth, suddenly they're getting increases in the number of dropped calls. They're having issues like with letting those users use video when it was, video conferencing meetings and things like that. So it was just a, kind of costly and not delivering a great user experience. So this was a case where they kind of decided to shift their approach to using the IGEL Cloud Gateway. That immediately actually saved them a ton of money. So they were able to get rid of all those dedicated VPN and internet connections, which just on its own saved them about 20,000 euros per month. But not only did it save them money, but it actually solved a lot of their issues, because from a user experience standpoint, they're now directly connecting these devices to the internet, but utilizing the Citrix HDX and the real-time optimization pack for Skype to deliver a very high quality experience, to the point where they were saying that it's, the home users actually now have a better experience with Skype than users at the office. And then from an IT standpoint, those firmware updates that were all being kind of bottlenecked at the gateway, because they can be now pushed out through the IGEL Cloud Gateway and take advantage of that efficient data transmission technique that I talked about earlier. They've got that down from over a month to now 2 or 3 days, which is really important, especially as we talk about the next topic with security, because obviously, pushing out updates is often driven by functionality, but it's also important from a security standpoint, to where you need to obviously maintain, you have a secure footprint on the endpoint, make sure that things like secure boot are in use to make sure that the device cannot be tampered with in any way, but also just the ability to push out updates reliably and quickly is essential from a security standpoint, because the longer it takes to push out those updates, the longer you have a window of vulnerability in place in your environment. And we saw that recently with the WPA2 vulnerability that was discovered late last year, where this was an example where, again, with its focus on the OS, IGEL, saw this, quickly pushed out an update for IGEL OS, and then because customers can reliably get these updates deployed, they were able to quickly close that vulnerability in a way that some of the other thin client vendors were not as quick to update, but also the time it takes the customers to push out those updates is much longer, because they, doesn't necessarily have the same level of reliability.
Yeah, I think Microsoft just pulled back a patch from July that they released a week ago. I think they just pulled back one of their patches.
Right.
But something I want to touch on with security with our deployment is this was a big selling point for us, and this really helped us move our project forward. So as an operations manager, security is not necessarily the number one thing in my mind. It's our security manager's number one item in his mind. I was concerned about the benefits my end users are going to see, the simplicity and management. But obviously I'm concerned about security, but the people who are really concerned about security besides my security manager are the CFO and the CEO and the COO. Every time a news article comes out about a data breach, they get more and more concerned about security. And when it comes to getting projects approved, if it's something that can help limit security risks, they were super easy to, super ready to listen and super receptive. And security played a big part in getting my project approved for a couple of reasons. Number one, the conversion from having the data on the endpoints to having the data in the data center was huge. With our 75 different locations spread across the entire country, in the past, we had student data, FERPA protected data, probably Sarbanes-Oxley data, spread all over the country. And now all of that's in our data center. There's nothing on my IGEL endpoints. There's no data on those endpoints. There's configurations and there's settings and there's an operating system, but it's a read-only operating system. People literally couldn't put data on that endpoint if they wanted to. So in the event that there was some kind of a breach in one of these remote locations, that somebody left the door open or somebody went out to lunch and some random person walked in and grabbed a machine off the desk, there's literally nothing on that endpoint with concern to my data and my company's data. And so the kind of the security philosophy of our virtual desktop deployment is that I'm going to remove attack vectors from the endpoints by using a stripped down version of the IGEL OS that is only going to provide the actual services that we're going to use. And then number two, I'm going to couple that with a virtual desktop infrastructure that's going to keep all my desktops and all my data in the data center. So whereas I went from before to having these 2,000 Windows endpoints that literally every single one had local attack vectors and physical security issues and data on all these endpoints, to having 2,000 machines that have no data risk, no flight risk, no attack vector on them. I've shored up the security of my organization. I can't even give you a number, but it was huge in getting my budget approved and moving things forward, and also, you know, securing our organization. If we had a data breach, and I'm sure a ton of people could relate to this, it threatens the future of your organization. And being able to secure these endpoints by only having the operating systems you need out there and getting the data off of the endpoints and keeping the data in the data center and then securing the data center, it's much better to secure the data center than have to, you know, secure 7,500 separate location and thousands of endpoints. So I just want to touch on that with regard to security as well.
Great, no, I appreciate that perspective. So, you know, we're kind of creeping up on the top of the hour with our allotted time here. So the timing is good to maybe switch gears and open it up to any questions, but hopefully, you know, kind of talking through some of these topics and hearing about some of the real world perspective from Scott and bringing in some of these other examples has been helpful. If you do have any questions, we do invite them. You can just type them right into the GoToWebinar interface, and we will try to go through and answer any questions that you may have. While we're waiting to see if any of those come in, also point you to a couple of other resources. IGEL just recently published a case study on Strayer University. So if you want to learn more about the situation that Scott's talked about specifically there, or there's also quite a few other case studies. If you're in a different vertical, perhaps in healthcare or elsewhere, you can check those all out. The URL's included here. And that might be helpful if you're kind of earlier in your evaluation process. If you're kind of later in the process, you can also download a free trial of IGEL on the website, igel.com/download. You know, Scott mentioned this isn't something that has to be a, you know, 3-week proof of concept. You can literally kind of download this, get the management system set up, and, you know, convert or USB boot some devices and kind of experience this all and see how it looks in your environment, literally, you know, in a day or less. So if you're later on, or if you have an existing deployment and are curious about it, you can try that. And then a final thing we'll mention too, obviously, like hopefully some of these examples, both, you know, Scott's example and some of the other quick examples I referenced were useful. You know, we're always looking for more of these. So if you have your own experience that you'd like to share, we would love to hear about it, either in a kind of one-on-one setting or IGEL frequently at events like VMworld and some of the smaller events. It's often, you know, doing video interviews and things like that. So it's extremely valuable that if people are willing to share your experience and kind of contribute to the learning of others, and, you know, maybe help somebody else avoid a stumbling block that you hit and had to work around. It's always helpful to kind of share information like that, and IGEL's very good about trying to facilitate that. So
yeah, I'd love to hear if anybody has any challenges that they're running up against with regard to either getting a VDI project off the ground, or any challenges they had with other thin clients, or any kind of barriers that are getting in the way of helping them move forward. You know, the other thing too is that if you're interested in more information about IGEL, I know that Doug Brown is on Twitter, Douglas A. Brown, at Douglas A. Brown, and he's constantly tweeting and giving a lot of great information about IGEL products. Absolutely. As well.
So, Enid, do we have any questions?
Yes, hi. No, there are no questions have been submitted so far.
All right, perfect. So also I would like to mention that we have the IGEL community, also a great source to figure out solutions to your problems, answers to your questions. This is a very quick way to really gather a lot of information about what's going on. Also from IGEL staff, as well as from customers and IGEL enthusiasts. So I also highly recommend that. If you do not have any additional questions, I would like to thank everybody that has joined the call, the webinar, and listened to the very interesting insights Scott provided us from the real world, and also thanks a lot to Doug gathering all this information and putting together this very interesting and very information-rich set of data. Thank you, everyone.
Yep, thanks for having me, Matthias. And if anybody's interested in asking me any questions offline about our experience or any challenges they're having, they can email. I'm happy to have them email me directly at scott@strayer.edu.
Thank you,
I'd
Scott.
be happy to take any questions offline.
Perfect. All right. Thanks a lot. And